Hello everyone and welcome to our next video in this topic on transport in plants. We're going to start off very quickly with a recap on the root structure. So take a moment to remember what are the different parts of the cross-section of a root. Okay, so hopefully you still remember the different parts of the root. Starting with the outer layer is called the epidermis, which is made out of many root hair cells. Now the layer inside the epidermis is called the cortex, and then we have the endodermis, and then right in the center we have the xylem as well as the phloem. Now this diagram is going to be really important, and there's some layers that you really need to be familiar with, because in today we're going to be looking at how water outside the plant here in the soil gets into the plant. So specifically we'll look at how water gets into the root hair cell, and then into the cortex, and eventually into the xylem of the root. Now this is part 1. In the next video we'll look at part 2, which is how water moves from the xylem of the root up all the way into the leaves. Okay, so let's start with part 1. Right, we're going to be talking about how water moves from the soil into the plant. And then also we're going to talk about how mineral ions are transported into the plant roots. And a bit about how the root hair cell is adapted for its function, which you've probably learned a bit about it already. And in the textbook, this can be found on the following pages. Well, let's start with a simple diagram. If you've read your textbook pages, you should have seen a similar diagram. And I would like you to look at this and label the soil particles, the soil solution, root hair cell, and the root hair. Pause and take a moment to do this. Alright, so let's label this diagram. Firstly, we have the soil particles. These brown color shapes represent soil particles. Then we have the soil solution, right, which is the fluid that surrounds the soil particles, right? So soil is not dry, it's moist usually. There's some fluid that surrounds it made up of water and different ions dissolved in it. That's called the soil solution. Then we have the root hair cell, which is over here, right? The root hair cell. And of course, the part of the root hair cell, which is a long and narrow extension, we call the root hair. Okay, so familiarize yourself with this diagram first, and let's move. Okay, so here's my diagram again, and just to emphasize again, the soil particles are surrounded by a thin film of moisture called the soil solution, right? And this soil solution is made out of water and dissolved mineral ions. Now the root hair cell has a root hair, and the root hair comes into contact with the soil solution. So it is here that the water will move from the soil solution into the root hair cell. Now how does that happen? Let's look on. So here's a table, and I would like you just to pause for a while and just try to kind of understand this table. This table shows you the concentration of sodium ions and chloride ions in a typical root hair cell, in the cell sap of the root hair cell, and also in the soil solution that surrounds it. Okay, so pause for a while, try to make sense of this, and try to answer the question, how does the concentration of ions in the soil solution compare with the concentration in the root hair cell? Right, now hopefully you realized this. You compared, okay, sodium, 10, right, milligrams per liter, and soil solution only 0.2. So it seems that the cell sap of the root hair cell has a higher concentration of sodium ions. And the same case can be found for chloride ions. The cell sap has a much higher concentration compared to the soil solution. Okay, so the mineral ion concentration is usually higher in the root hair cell compared to the soil solution. This is usual, okay, usually. Now what does that mean for the water potential? Right, we've seen that the mineral ion concentration is higher in the root hair cell compared to the soil solution. So how does the water potential of the soil solution compare with that of the root hair cell? Pause and think about this for a while. Well, hopefully you remembered that the higher the concentration of mineral ions, or anything actually, the higher the concentration of the solute, right, the lower the water potential. Okay, so the two are kind of inversely related. When one goes up, the other comes down. So in this case, the water potential of the soil solution is higher than the water potential of the root hair cell set. Right? So low concentration of ions outside, higher water potential in the soil solution outside the root hair cell. So as a result, how does water move into the root hair cell? Okay, that water potential is higher in the soil solution as compared to the water potential in the root hair cell. So how will water move? Please bring back the knowledge from your chapter on osmosis. Well, water will move by osmosis, of course. Water will move by osmosis from the soil solution into the root hair cell. Okay, so I hope this step-by-step explanation is helpful for you. So now we know that water enters the root hair cell by osmosis. Okay, so the next question is, how do mineral ions move into the root hair cell? Suppose the root hair cell wants to absorb mineral ions because the plant needs mineral ions to survive. How can the root hair cell absorb mineral ions? Look at the concentrations of ions again and come up with an answer. Okay, pause for a while. So hopefully you realized that to absorb, for example, to absorb sodium ions, the root hair cell needs to move sodium ions against the concentration gradient, right? Because the concentration is higher inside the cell than outside the cell in the soil solution. And hence, hopefully you concluded that the root hair cell absorbs mineral ions by active transport, right? So from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. Now, mineral ions can be absorbed by active transport if they are in relatively lower concentrations in the soil solution. But what happens if the mineral ion concentration is higher in the soil solution? So for instance, what if the plant was growing in a place where there was a lot more sodium ions? So let's say this will be 13.0 or something. Now, the root hair cells will absorb sodium ions along its concentration gradient, right? From a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. And hopefully that rings off some bells and you remember that that process is called diffusion. Okay, so let's summarize. So we've seen that water is absorbed into root hair cells by osmosis. And that's because after we take into account all the different types of mineral ions, the water potential of the root hair cell is usually lower than that of the soil solution. So water moves in by osmosis. Now, when it comes to mineral ions, they can either be absorbed by active transport or diffusion. And this depends on the type of ion that we're looking at. Some ions, for example, maybe sodium ions, will have a very high concentration in the soil solution. So they can just be absorbed easily by diffusion. Now other ions, for example, maybe chloride ions, have a very low concentration in the soil solution compared to the root hair cell. And so the root hair cell will need to use energy to absorb it against its concentration gradient by active transport. Okay, but when you take all the mineral ions together, the water potential of the root hair cell is usually still lower than that of the soil solution. and that's why water is absorbed by osmosis. Now this is just a slight extension question. If you have ever been to these places like Sungai Bulu Nature Reserve, you would see trees like these, mangroves, that grow in very near the sea. And these plants are called halophytes because they, in a sense, love salt. They grow in a very high salt environment near the seawater. Now I want you to think about how this will affect the plant's ability to absorb water, and what do you think the plant can do to overcome it? Alright, we can discuss this more in class. Alright, so we've talked about how water moves into the root hair cell. So here's my diagram again of the root. You can see here a root hair cell. Right, this is the epidermis, and then the inner layer inside the epidermis is the cortex. So this is our cortex, right? This yellow layer is the endodermis, and then we have the xylem here, right in the middle. Okay, so this is the xylem. Now, we've already talked about how water moves from the soil solution into the root hair cell. Now, we're going to talk about how water moves from the root hair cell through the cortex, eventually to the xylem. Now you'll need to know how to describe this well. So let's learn. Okay, so the first part we've already talked about. Water enters the root hair cell by osmosis, moving from the soil solution, which has a higher water potential, into the root hair cell, which has a lower water potential. Now when water moves into this root hair cell here, it dilutes the cell sap of the root hair cell because there's now more water inside this root hair cell. How does that affect the water potential of this root hair cell? Well, it causes the water potential of this root hair cell to increase, right? Because there's more water inside it now. So, the water potential of this root hair cell over here now becomes higher than the water potential of the inner cell that is next to it, right? For example, this cell here, which is in the cortex. So the water potential of this root hair cell is now higher than the water potential of this inner cell. Therefore, water moves by osmosis, right, from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential. What happens next is a chain reaction, right? Okay, look at this. When water enters this inner cell, it causes the water potential of this cell to increase, right? So the water potential of this cell, let's call it B, cell B's water potential is now going to be higher than the water potential of cell C. So water will move from a region of higher water potential in cell B to cell C. And water continues to move this way from cell to cell. So from C, it'll move on to this cell, which is inner cell, all the way through the cortex until it reaches the xylem. Okay? So that's how we explain how water moves from the soil solution into the xylem of the root. Now in the last part of this video, we'll be looking at how our root hair cells adapted for absorption. Okay, so you should know some of this already. So here's our root hair cell. Now the first adaptation, of course we already know, is that the root hair is long and narrow. Okay, and we already know that this increases the surface area to volume ratio to increase the rate of absorption of water and also of mineral ions. Secondly, okay, root hair cells have a cell sap that contains a high concentration of sugar, amino acids, and salts, so that it has a low or relatively low water potential compared to the soil solution. Right, so that is what allows water to move into the cell by osmosis. Also, the cell surface membrane prevents the sap from leaking out so that this difference in water potential can be maintained. Right, if there was a break in the cell membrane, then it wouldn't have this difference in water potential anymore. Now finally, the root hair cell also has many mitochondria, which produce energy, which the root hair cell needs for active transport of mineral ions. Alright, that's all for this video. See you in the next one.